Hello and welcome today. I'm Will and today I'm going to be talking about a David Gemmell ranking. And so I've not actually done a ranking on the channel ever, so let's see how it goes today. A little while ago I put a poll up, would people rather see a Stephen King ranking or a David Gemmell ranking? And quite surprisingly, David Gemmell won. I thought Stephen King would, of course. He is probably the most well-known speculative writer nowadays. But yeah, David Gemmell, it seems a lot more people want to know more about him, and many people may not talk about him as much, but he's still a nostalgic favourite of theirs. And also, a lot of people, they kind of approach commenting videos on here, or the Brothers Gwyn, saying where should they start with David Gemmell's works, because he's got quite a few different series with different contexts and cultures and different books you have to read before, and it can be a little bit confusing. And so hopefully this video clarifies that slightly. I've got 11 books. I've left a bit more space this side so I can rank them and look a little bit professional and have it clear kind of what books I preferred. So there's 11 books here, and I'm going to start from my least favourite to my favourite. And just to be clear, some of them, they did not click with me, but the majority of books I really enjoyed, because I wouldn't read 11 books by an author if I didn't love his works. And so David Gemmell is for sure one of my favourite authors of all time, and I do need to read more by him. Papa Gwyn has got a whole collection outside, and lately he told me, I think David Gemmell published 32 books and every single one was a Sunday Times bestseller. That is a rare feat and testament to his skill alone. But now let's really get into it and start with my 11th favourite David Gemmell read. I've got the Shield of Thunder book 2 of his Troy retelling. So this is a trilogy, and I'll talk about book 1 a bit later. I preferred that, and I also preferred book 3. Book 2, I found it a bit jarring. Most of the perspectives here are not in book 1, and then a lot of the characters in book 1 are on the periphery, and that caught me very off guard. And I think that might work with a series that is longer, maybe 5 or 6 books, but it also meant that, because obviously there's only one book after this, for me it felt a bit rushed, because David Gemmell was obviously rushing towards setting the premise for book 3, and that meant that the character craft seemed very kind of unorganic and unnatural, because he was just kind of rushing, trying to get you attached to these characters, I think. So I think it was a bit of experimentation from him. These were his last books that he wrote, and so maybe it's him trying something a bit different, but for me it did not work. But the rest of the series is much better in my opinion, so it's still worth picking up if you want a very different Greek retelling. And yeah, but it's not my favourite, and actually it's my least favourite David Gemmell book that I've read. So that's number 11. And now into number 10, I've got Storm Rider, book 4 of the Regante. This is a completely different world. This is book 4 of the Regante series, which, if I'll just explain, I'll be talking about all 4 of these today. But Regante, you can almost break into 2 duologies. You've got the first 2, which is Sword and Storm and Midnight Falcon, which are set kind of, it's almost like the Romans v the Celts, as the Romans are infringing on the Celtic lands. And then book 3, Ravenheart, and book 4, Storm Rider, go hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after the end of Midnight Falcon. And so it's considered the same series because it's the same world, but it's completely different characters. It's got some thematic overlays, and obviously the Regante, this clan, are at the heart of it. But overall, I would consider them to be different duologies. So Storm Rider, the second part of the latter duology, the last installment of the Regante series, for me, didn't really click. I really loved the enmity between, as I said, the Regante and kind of the Roman enemy. And I also loved Ravenheart, which is book 3 of this series, is much more about rising from oppression. And it kind of reminded me of Braveheart a bit, but smaller scale. Imagine just the first half of Braveheart reminded me a lot of Ravenheart. Storm Rider for me got a bit too fantastical in many ways, where there's another realm, and it meant that the enemies weren't as tangible, and I didn't feel a hatred for them as I do for many in the previous installments. And also the main characters didn't have as much as a hook for me, so this was a read that I didn't not enjoy it. It was quite easy to read, as always with David Gemmell. It's a page turner, but I wasn't really attached to any of the characters, and at the end it was like, okay, I enjoyed that, but there's nothing that really would make me want to revisit it. And so I know I sound a bit negative early in this, but that's because I'm obviously starting with the bottom. So carry on a bit further and you're going to hear me raving in a good way about the latter books. But number 9, I've got Fall of Kings. This is book 3 of the Troy trilogy that I was talking about earlier. This ends really solidly, very satisfyingly, and I just think that it's a great way for the series to end. I think it was brought down by not being as attached to those characters in the second installment, as I described earlier. So they are carried into book 3, and then you also have the characters of book 1 back in the heart of it as well. So I do like the idea of those kind of almost separate stories coming together for book 3. But for me, because I wasn't as attached to about half the cast, it did drag down the story slightly. But it's still a really enjoyable conclusion with some epic action sequences. And obviously we know what's going to happen at the end of Troy, but David Gemmell did a brilliant way of subverting a lot of those ideas and creating his own very creative ways for these events to unfold. So I found that really enjoyable and really interesting to read. So that is number 9. And now going into, I think this is the first Draenei book I'm talking about. So Draenei Sagas, the Draenei Tales, I think they're called. I think there's about maybe 10 or 15 books set in the world where the Draenei are. And there's a lot of separate series, so you can read them in almost any order. And one of those is Waylander. And so I've got Waylander Book 2, The Realm of the Wolf. And so there's 3 Waylander books. And this is, I've read all 3, so this is the first I'm talking about. Number 2, I have to say, I've read this, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, so I may be a bit vague on the details or get some things wrong, so forgive me if I do. But I believe Waylander 2 is where our main character, Waylander, who's a bit of a rogue, he's a warrior, but as I said, a rogue as well. He's often seen on the criminal side of things. He journeys into the lands of the tribes who are kind of seen as the enemies in legend, which I'll talk about later, and I found that dynamic really interesting, seeing them from the other side. And also, there's a lot of characters that, if you've read kind of Legend or the later works in the Draenei series, that these kind of characters are talked about a bit as well. But I really enjoyed, I remember how the magic was worked into Waylander, but I remember the ending being a little bit flat. It was a really good book still, but with David Gemmell, I often expect the endings to be the best part. And so I think I was a little bit let down when I read this, that it didn't blow me away like the others do. But Waylander is a brilliant central character. And yeah, I love his stories. I love all 3, as I'll be talking about the others higher up on this list. And then, so that's 11, 10, 9, 8. On to number 7. Lord of the Silver Bow. This is the first book of the Troy trilogy, so this is the whole trilogy covered now. The first installment was my favourite. I really enjoyed how different it was. As I said, it's a great series to pick up if you want some fresh Greek retelling. I think nowadays a lot can feel a bit similar because there have been so many. Although, of course, there are brilliant ones. My favourite being The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. But anyway, that's a tangent. Back to the David Gemmell books. This is my favourite of that trilogy. I really enjoy how we follow characters quite a bit before the events of Troy actually unfold. It's more, book 1 is about kind of the causes and consequences that lead to acting as a catalyst for the War of Troy and for Helen taken away and all of that jazz. So this is about the build-up, and I really enjoyed that. It's something I've never seen before. I thought David Gemmell did a really good job working that out. And we've got kind of a pirate aspect as well with ancient Greece. That's a really unique premise that David Gemmell really executes really, really well. And even if, as I said, the other books in the series aren't as strong in my opinion, I still think it's really worth picking this up. Especially, as I said, if you want some more Greekness in your life. And who doesn't? Who doesn't? And then next up, I have got Ravenheart, book 3 of the Regante series. This is, as I said, the latter duology. So this is book 1 that reminds me a bit of Braveheart. As imagine it like the Highlanders when they're being oppressed. They're not allowed weapons. They're not allowed to show their colours. And they're being oppressed by, originally in the first duology, it's like Romans, but I imagine they're like the British. And I really enjoyed how the Regante, it shows how they kind of kept their culture alive and secret, but also the constant turmoils facing them. And this ending, it has to be up with the best endings of David Gemmell. It is absolutely fantastic. I remember having literal goosebumps when I first read it. It is just extraordinary. And even though there's some foreshadowing and you kind of know something big is going to happen in this end sequence, it still just hits you so hard and it brings a tear to your eye. And it's done in a very different way from his other endings, which may be a bit more epic. This is a bit more tailored down, a bit more intimate, but still very hard hitting. And so that is Ravenheart, book 3 of the Regante. And now getting into the top 5. All of these are very good books that I really, really enjoyed. Actually, I don't have physically the next one I'm talking about. This is Hero in the Shadows, which is book 3 of the Waylander trilogy. And so I remember the beginning of this taking a little bit while to get into. I think, again, I read this about 7 or 8 years ago. I think the beginning ends with kind of a key character not being in it anymore. And so I remember being a bit disappointed because I was like, whoa, that's what I was expecting this book to be about. But then once I got back into it, I really thoroughly enjoyed it. And oh my gosh, I think there's a lot of endings to these books that I absolutely love. As I said, Ravenheart gave me goosebumps, and there's some I'll talk about later that actually one of them did bring a tear to my eye. So this is probably the only other one that made me nearly cry, or I might have actually cried, I don't quite remember. But the ending is so poignant and perfect for the ending of Waylander. You followed him for 3 books, and he's a character who's got so much weighing on his shoulders. His past crushes him in the present, and the more you discover about that, the more heartbreaking it is. And the ending, how it kind of relates to how his story begun, is just so powerful. And David Gemmell, I don't know how it's genius the way he thought of resolving this finale for Waylander. It felt so fitting because each installment of Waylander is almost like a standalone story. It's got its own conflict and its own resolution. And so I was wondering, is book 3 just going to be basically that, but bigger, and then end on that? But it is, but then the way it ends links back. And that probably sounds like just I'm speaking another language if you haven't read it. But it is just really, please trust me, genius how he resolves that. And that is why I think overall I preferred the main body of book 2 over book 3. But the ending, oh my gosh. An ending is so important to how you view a book and a series. And that is true here. And that's why Hero in the Shadows is so high up. And now into the top 4. All of these are 5 stars in my opinion. I've got book 1 of Waylander. And so I've just talked about book 3. Now book 1. This is where we first meet the characters. It was one of my first David Gemmell books that I read. So I think it's the first one I read outside of Legend. And so maybe there's a bit of sentimentality. Because again, I don't remember actually too much about it. This would have been even longer ago, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. So it is quite vague in my mind. There's a mist in front of most of what happens, but I know there's some incredible action sequences, and I just absolutely love the politics that come into Waylander as well. David Gemmell, he doesn't really go too much into political machinations. There's always a little bit, but I remember there being a bit more with Waylander, especially as he's one of the cleverer characters of David Gemmell's books. And as we follow him, of course, we get an insight into how his intelligence is used and how he utilises that to firstly stay alive and then help himself as well. So yeah, that is Waylander, book 1, and my 4th favourite David Gemmell book of all time. And now into the top 3, the big guns. We've got one that many people would probably expect to be number 1. So I'm sorry it's not there, but I still really, really love this book. It is Legend by David Gemmell. His first book, the one that he's most well known for. It's a standalone. We follow Druss, who's his most well-known character. Druss is a legend. He is a legend, but also he's a man of legend and myth as well to those who know his story. And so in this, we've got a city called Dros Delnoch is being put under siege by huge forces. And basically, Dros Delnoch guards the way into the Draenei lands. If that falls, the Draenei kingdom will fall as well. And so it's a city built kind of into the mountains as a pass. It's very hard to conquer, but there's very few soldiers defending it. And the legend called Druss, he is called back into action and he returns to defend Dros Delnoch. And so this is the only David Gemmell I've reread recently. And I did really enjoy it on a reread. I'd say that when you read David Gemmell's earlier works, you have to be of mind that they are quite dated. These were written, I think this was 1980 or maybe 1982. And so there's some terms and some aspects of this book that do feel quite dated for the time, which I found quite interesting because there's aspects that also feel very progressive, especially when obviously in the 80s, maybe 60s, 70s, 80s, you've often got a theme in fantasy of kind of the armies from the East are the enemy, and you don't really get much more characterization than that. Whereas in this, you've got kind of a flip of that, where the armies are coming from the East, but they are very human and you really like some of them as well. And they are given the same respect as the characters on the Dros Delnoch side. And so in that way, it felt very progressive, but there's others where it doesn't as much. So I'd say beware of that when you do read this. I do think that does definitely change as you get into David Gemmell's later works. He definitely changed as a writer, but I'd say do be aware of that in Legend. But this is a book that is a page turner. It's got a lot of those classic fantasy vibes, but with twists and turns as well. And there's not, can't think of any other book which is basically mainly a siege, but it's so riveting. And I love the different phases of this battle are done so well. And it's mainly about the character interactions between. And it feels very heroic. It does feel inspiring in a way that isn't cringy and isn't cheesy. It's done in a way which feels quite modern, as well as harkening to those kind of traditional fantasy ideas. So that's Legend, my third favourite David Gemmell read of all time. And the first book I read by him. Number 2, I have got Midnight Falcon by, of course, David Gemmell, book 2 of the Regante series. So the ending of the first duology in my mind. Wow, this book is brilliant. So in this, we follow Bane, who is the son of a very, very pivotal character of book 1 of the series. And I remember when I started book 2, I was like, oh, I want the POV from book 1, you know. But very soon, I was in the mind of Bane. I absolutely love his character. He's a bit of an outsider because of his past, which I can't say for spoilers of book 1. But I love the relationship between book 1 and 2. It is set quite a few years later than book 1, I think 15, maybe 20, but it's still got the main cast of characters, and it's continuing that enmity between the Regante and the Romans who are trying to conquer them. Obviously, they're not called the Romans, it's fantasy, but I'm saying kind of the cultures they're inspired by. So I absolutely love that premise. I love that period of history, and David Gemmell was definitely inspired by the historical side of things. Midnight Falcon, look, I'm a character-driven reader, and this and book 1, I'd say, are the ones with David Gemmell's best characters. There are some incredible action sequences in here, and there are heartbreaking moments as well in very small-scale action, but there is also, at the heart of it, it's just the characters. That's why you care about the action, and that's why you care about the Regante holding out and fighting for their freedom. It's because you love the characters at the heart of it. There are some that you absolutely hate as well, but it just feels so real because of that, because they are all very great. And David Gemmell, I'm not sure if he was, but he's often described as basically like the first author to have grey characters in the heart of quite traditional fantasy landscapes. And so that's definitely been taken a lot further with grimdark and modern fantasy, but I think that David Gemmell was quite pivotal to the evolution of the fantasy genre to what so many of us love nowadays. So even if you don't love his books, you definitely owe him a lot for how he changed the fantasy genre. And I'd like to do a bit more research into how he how we can really see physically what changed. But he's definitely a big influence on many readers, and he's a lot of kind of the first, alongside Raymond E. Feist, that many people started reading beyond The Hobbit. And now into book 1, my favourite David Gemmell book of all time. And we have Sword in the Storm, book 1 of Regante. If you were detectives, you would have noticed I hadn't talked about book 1 of this series yet. Sword in the Storm, we follow Conover, my favourite David Gemmell character. And so, of course, I won't have to ramble about this too long because I've already said the premise. It's the Celts against the Romans. Conover is a young man. This is a coming-of-age story, and it is exceptional how it starts so small scale with the classic kind of fantasy village life, which I absolutely adore. It's done so uniquely, and I can tell that, like, obviously Papa Gwyn was very inspired by this kind of beginning of series, as you see with Corban in Malice, but obviously with his own very different take on it. David Gemmell is one of Papa Gwyn's favourite authors, so a bit of an Easter egg there. But Sword in the Storm, as I said, it's got my favourite character. I love how different it feels. It feels natural and organic. It doesn't feel like it's got the fantasy beats for the sake of it. It feels like it's evolving to the pace that it really should for this story. It's got a great cast of characters. It has got moments that there's just so much palpable tension, and it really does tug at the heartstrings. I believe I did cry at the end of this. There's an incredible action sequence, but again, you're immersed and enthralled because of the characters at the heart of it. Sword in the Storm, I think, should be held up with the modern greats of fantasy as well. This isn't just one that was great at the time, and it's not just great because of nostalgia. It is wonderful in a modern day sense as well. My brother Ed has been rereading this series lately, and he said that on his first read, Midnight Falcon was his favourite, and I think on his second, Sword in the Storm was, but he said that he agrees that these are his favourite David Gemmell books. And Papa Gwyn, I think he's read 20 David Gemmell books, maybe even more, and he said that Sword in the Storm and the Midnight Falcon are his favourites as well. And so maybe us Gwyns are just really similar, or maybe there's a common theme that these will be most people's favourite books written by David Gemmell, but they certainly are mine. And so that is Sword in the Storm, and that is all 11 of the David Gemmell books that I've read. And this is a ranking from my least favourite to my favourite Everyone, thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any David Gemmell. Let me know if you're going to, and let me know your thoughts of any of these, please. And let me know if there's any other authors you'd like me to do a ranking of that I've read quite a few books by. But everyone, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Keep on reading and stay safe.